The Fire Nation, one of the most iconic villainous forces in pop culture, a part of the beloved world of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Throughout the show, we spend a lot of time with the Fire Nation and grow to hate them thoroughly, and yet we understand why. The Fire Nation shows us how dictatorships can form and all the tragedies they can cause, both to outsiders as much as their own citizens. In this video, I want to take a close look at these famous villains, try and understand what makes them work so well and makes them the perfect villains. Avatar is a world divided into 4 nations which have endured plenty of fighting and wars. That's the reason the Avatar was created. But the biggest conflict in the world's history is the 100-Year War, started by the Fire Nation. To quickly cover some of the world building about the Fire Nation, they are by far the most advanced nation because they can create and manipulate heat, which basically means and so, going into the show, they're not only able to easily burn down any village, they also have a massive navy giving them mastery over water, but in the show they develop land and air assault vehicles. Any advantage that the other 3 nations might have is quickly beaten by the technological capabilities of mastering fire. Plus, the Fire Nation is the most united out of the 4 nations. The air nomads are divided into 4 temples at the different corners of the world, which we saw made it very easy to ambush them, plus they just aren't fighters. The Water Nation is divided into 2 poles, one of which is super weak and the other strong, which makes one of them be able to be plundered and the other is defeated with a big enough navy, so it's not that hard to beat them. And the Earth Kingdom is made up almost entirely of small towns, which are easily plundered, and then only a few big military cities, like Ba Sing Se. But the Fire Nation, on the other hand, has a big island, which they dominate, and then the Earth Kingdom colonies, which, since there's nothing around, is safe. We see throughout the show just how hard it would be to launch an attack at the Fire Nation, even at their weakest, when they lose their fire. Facing a master plan, the Fire Nation still won. And finally, world building wise, the Fire Nation has the advantage of striking the first move and knocking out entirely one of the 3 adversaries. The Fire Nation is a formidable foe, but that isn't what makes them such great villains. The first thing about the Fire Nation, which is so interesting, is manipulation. As we know, Fire Lord and his daughter are known for manipulation, but it's a trait leading back to before the war had even started. Sozin, who was the Fire Lord that started the war, abused his friendship with the Avatar to begin the 100-Year War. Sozin had dreams of expanding the greatness of the Fire Nation and wanted the help of the Avatar to achieve it. Avatar Roku, of course, said no, but that didn't stop Sozin. In silence, he conquered what would become the Fire Nation colonies, and Roku almost killed him for it. But Sozin, starting on a path which would continue for generations, abused his relationship with a person to get what he wanted, in this case, have his life spared. And then Roku died, and then the planning of the war continued once more, leading to Sozin's Comet and the Air Nation genocide, where Sozin tried to kill the reincarnation of his best friend so he could wage war on the world, which is truly messed up. And now, returning to Ozai and Azula. Ozai was a master manipulator and did some truly cruel stuff. For example, when his nephew died, he used that as a power grab to take the throne from his brother, who would already be suffering from the death of his only son and his wife earlier. And while even Fire Lord Azula called out Ozai for his cruelty, he was still rewarded with the throne, which is a real tragedy because with Iroh on the throne, the Fire Nation might have been saved. And of course, we can't not talk about what happened to Zuko. He called out injustice and dishonored his father for that. The sad thing about the Fire Nation is that only the cruelest people climb the ladder. The top military leaders are the most horrible people who look out only for themselves And that makes sense because the Fire Nation is the aggressor, so they have no need for peace. Plus, firebending is fueled by rage, at least during the war. One of the most interesting story concepts is when Zuko joins Team Avatar and gets closure from his father. He loses the ability to firebend. The Fire Nation has warped bending, so if you aren't some hate-filled monster, you can't use your bending. And the hate is now everyone. It's what everyone is taught, most likely as a part of the war effort, and that's why so many of the Fire Nation citizens just kind of suck. And then we have Piandao. He doesn't firebend, he uses a sword, and he's a good person. But the Fire Nation, they warp bending, so it only creates the fire hate-filled monsters, because that's how they're gonna win. Also, public perception change during the war is something which again is very interesting with propaganda. Sozin started the war claiming to want to spread the greatness of the Fire Nation, yet vilified the other nations at the same time. In one of my favorite books, The Once and Future King, there was a part of the book where we went to this ant colony which worked as a Big Brother-esque fascist regime, and the ants waged war on the opposite ideas that the enemy is weak, therefore we deserve their food, yet we have to defend against them because they pose a threat to our food. That is a great comparison of how the Fire Nation attacks. In Season 3 episode where Aang goes to the Fire Nation school, we learn that the Fire Nation says that the air nomads had a navy to hide the fact of their senseless genocide. And the real tragedy of the Fire Nation is that the greatness that they had before the war was all sacrificed with the war effort. But before I get to that, if you've enjoyed the video thus far, please do me a favor and subscribe. I'm getting really close to monetization, and subscribing helps me get there. And let me know that you want more videos like this, especially with the live-action Avatar. But back to the Fire Nation. In various Season 3 episodes, we learn that the people living in the Fire Nation aren't much better than in the Earth Kingdom, just with the problem wearing a different mask. In The Painted Lady, we see a Fire Nation village living in extreme poverty because the Fire Nation factory, which is upstream, is polluting a river from which they sustain their economy through fishing. And the starving village is something we have seen plenty of times in Avatar in the Earth Kingdom, just of course because they're being plundered. Plus, the fact that so many of the men and women need to die in war or commit themselves to the pursuit of war, the endless war that the Fire Nation started really helps no one in the end besides the man on the throne, being Ozai or Azula. And yet possibly the most powerful thing we see related to the Fire Nation comes from the Southern Raiders. Although we've seen how powerful the Fire Nation is, how ruthless their soldiers are, we see something that defies that. In this episode, we see Katara on the hunt for the person who killed her mother. And when she finds him, he's the shell of a man. He lives with his mother and is utterly useless and helpless. The soldiers of the all-powerful Fire Nation is really just an act, or better, a fixture of the power of those in charge. The soldiers, when they are the ones in control, will subject everyone to nothing but cruelty. But in this episode, we see that when they lose that power, they really aren't all that scary. And that is the brilliance of the writing of the Fire Nation. The Fire Nation is like a fire. Anything that it touches will wither away. Everything in its path, but also the kindling that started it, will burn. No one is safe, and it must be respected, which it is by so few people. Speaking of evil, Emperor Bellows is one of the most cruel cartoon villains of all time. To learn more, make sure to check out this video.